This lesson covers creating a virtual machine. And remember, the virtual machine is really the goal for the reason we're using Hyper-V. We wish to create these virtual environments into which we can install operating systems and then our server applications. It's actually very easy to create a virtual machine. I go to New, Virtual Machine. Now I'm going to create this from scratch. Most likely in your environment, you would actually want to create a series of templates. So you would install the operating system once, configure it, patch it, and then you would run sysprep, which generalizes the operating system, removes the SID, the GUID, allows it to be duplicated. It would then shut down that VM, and you would then save that VHD file in a special location and name it as a template. When you then needed to create new virtual machines in the future, you would just copy that template into the new VHD location, and then the VM would use that template. It would run through a specialized phase of sysprep, create a new SID, a new GUID. You'll be up and running very, very quickly. You don't really want to be installing operating systems from virtual ISO files for every single virtual machine. And indeed, I'm showing you all of this through Hyper-V Manager. The reality is, again, in a production environment, you would want to leverage System Center Virtual Machine Manager, which has full template capabilities. But right here, I'm going to say a new VM. I give it a name. So we call this Test VM 22. I can specify to use the default location, or I can put in my own location. So maybe I'm going to want to create it under E, Virtuals. And it will actually create a subfolder named the name of the VM. I can give it an amount of memory, and I can say if I want to use dynamic memory or not, and I'm going to cover that in more detail in the next lesson. I can say which virtual switch the network adapter should be configured to connect to. Now, by default, it's going to add a synthetic network adapter, unless in the next set of options I say it needs to install over the network, but we'll get there in a second. I can say if it should create a new virtual hard drive, if it should use an existing virtual hard drive. For example, I've already created one, I created it from a template, or don't do anything yet, I'll install it later. Then I can say, how am I going to install this operating system? So I can say don't do anything yet. I can say install it from a boot CD, so map it to a physical CD drive in the server, or far more likely, you're going to say an ISO file and specify the location of the ISO file. I could specify a floppy boot disk, this is a very old operating system, or I can say install an operating system from a network-based installation server. If I select this, this is going to use a PXE boot, booting over the network, so the wizard will actually configure the VM with a legacy network adapter. I'll say install later, next, and finish. You have now created a virtual machine. Likewise, I can do all of this through PowerShell. I have a new VM, a path where I want to create that virtual machine, the VHD path, so I'm using an existing VHD in this example. I'm setting the amount of memory, and the switch it should connect to. So I'll run that command. And I now see I have my new test VM 10. I could also then do some additional configuration. I'm going to say I want to use dynamic memory. Here's my maximum amount of memory. Here's my minimum amount of memory. And I want 2 processor cores, so 2 virtual CPUs. So if I go back and look at my VM through settings, I'll see my memory has a startup amount, a minimum, and a maximum to match what I just configured. I also have 2 virtual processors. And notice in here I can do many other configurations through the graphical interface. One of the great things about the PowerShell is instead of passing a path to the VHD, I can say a new VHD path, specify a new VHD size, and it will actually create the VHD as part of that VM creation. So now if I look at my file system, I see I now have this new dynamic 11 disk, which is what I specified as part of my new VHD. And notice it's creating these folders for the VM configuration files. All of the configuration is actually from this XML. And one of the great things in Windows Server 2012 is, in the past, if I wanted to move a VM between Hyper-V hosts, I would have to export out the virtual machine, and then I could import it back in. With Windows Server 2012, as long as I have the folder that contains the configuration, this XML file, and the VHDs, I can just do an import. It will fix up the format for me automatically. I don't have to have done that export first. You always should, just to be on the safe side, but it's not a requirement in Windows Server 2012. So I can now configure and modify my virtual machines. I can right click, I can start them, stop them, or even delete them. Likewise from PowerShell, I can get a list of all my virtual machines. And I can here remove all of them, but I've done what if, so it won't actually do that deletion. I can even start them from PowerShell. Notice I've also listed here the ability to add a legacy network adapter. So this is actually adding into that test VM10 a legacy NIC. So if I now look at this virtual machine, I'm going to see two network adapters, the synthetic network adapter and this legacy network adapter. Remember, this will be seen as an emulated Intel NIC by the guest operating system and indeed a boot environment. The key thing is I'm actually going to go now and jump into a virtual machine. If I run Device Manager, it's seeing emulated hardware. So it just sees an ACPI x64 based machine. It does see an emulated because this is what allows us to boot from the IDE controller. But my network adapter, for example, is a Hyper-V. My storage controller, I'll see a Hyper-V SCSI controller. My human interface devices are all emulated. So it's actually abstracted from the physical hardware in the machine, which gives me this great mobility that I can move Hyper-V machines between different servers. This concludes the lesson on creating virtual machines.